Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good discussions. I was following some of the notes on the Google Docs. Great notes, great reflections. Some of the things that I see a lot of comments around green infrastructure providing safety, storm mitigation, beauty and well-being, actions that people might be working on or think that are important, encouraging private property owners to go beyond having just a nice lawn in their yard, fostering a mentality of care and not just maintenance. I think that came up in a couple of groups. Concern about the loss of old growth. We're living that right now. Contacting council and staff to demand more green infrastructure. So great suggestions. And please do go ahead and share some of those in the chat if you have a moment. But given the time, we'll continue moving forward. I'm going to introduce you again to Tara Mahoney. You've met her in the previous sessions. Tara will be bringing some examples of green infrastructure initiatives and the ways that they are creatively communicating and engaging. Tara Mahoney holds a PhD in communications from Simon Fraser University. Her focus is on participatory politics and climate change communications. Tara is co-founder and creative director of the civic engagement agency, Gen Y Media. Tara, over to you.
Thank you, Oliver. Hello, everybody. Again, it's nice to see you for those that are coming back, and welcome to those who are here for the first time. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure being part of this series, and thanks again to Joanna and Oliver for inviting me. I've not only enjoyed presenting, but also learned a lot from the group, and yeah, just I feel really energized and more engaged than I was before. So thank you to everybody for your the energy that you're bringing to this space. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in and get started. We'll move to the next slide. As always, I'm just going to kind of frame the topic a little bit, drawing on some current events and other things. Talk briefly about the innovation equation, but again, as we did in the last session, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it because I did that in the first two sessions. So if you're interested in the equation itself, I kind of go into it in more depth in sessions 1 and 2, which we have recordings for. So you can go back and watch those if that's of interest. And then, yeah, I'll talk about some interesting case examples where the innovation equation is being taken up in a few kind of like creative and effective ways, in my opinion. So we'll move to the next slide. So yeah, when we're talking about green infrastructure, just a couple things I wanted us to kind of keep in mind. One is, Vancouver, it's probably not a surprise to people, is a leader in this space. Quite a lot's happening at the municipal level, especially since, the climate change issue has become even more serious over the past few years, and the climate emergency declaration and things like that. They're really ramping up even more than they were before, which is great. But I think there's just some things to keep in mind as this happens. One is the equity issue, which, as Vancouverites, we have experience with, where green infrastructure often, for all the reasons that Oliver was mentioning coming up in the chat, it does make neighborhoods more enjoyable and beautiful. It does increase your kind of sometimes food security, storm mitigation, other things. So this increases property values, which can increase inequality and further fuel the housing crisis that we're already in. And it's true in Vancouver, but it's true in cities all over the world that the poorer neighborhoods are often the less green ones. So things like the heat island effect, where concrete and buildings make neighborhoods hotter, and trees and greenlands make neighborhoods cooler, is happening in, so like the downtown east side, for example. You compare that to like Kerrisdale, and you can just see the disproportionate effects that that income and class can have when we talk about green infrastructure and eco-gentrification and these kinds of things. So this is just a really important issue to keep our eye on when we're talking about these things. Another couple things I wanted to mention. to keep in mind in our discussion is the opportunities COVID-19 kind of presents. This has come up before in other sessions, but just, this sort of reevaluation of public space and what is possible with policy and other things. And so that presents some interesting opportunities for us to kind of move on in the next year or so, given what we now know is possible at a government action level. And the role again of citizen power in this, especially at the local level. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later on, but this movement of like top down meets bottom up has been a real theme of this this series, and just thinking about like, what can we do with our neighbors at a local level that builds community and makes us feel alive? And then what can we advocate for from our governments to support our efforts, is kind of that sweet spot that we're trying to make clear and to like articulate for folks. So we'll just move to the next slide. So yeah, the innovation equation, as most of you know, is the climate communications principles times community assets. So these are things that are available to us now. These are things like hobbies or food or conversations with your neighbors or arts and culture, things that the community is already doing and already has access to. Plus strategic allies. So these are organizations that like the city, the municipality, or businesses or community centers that can scale efforts. So yeah, so your efforts are just not just in a sort of a singular zone, but they can be scaled out. And then that equals climate, creative climate action. So this is the framework that we're working with. And again, it's just a quick shorthand way to kind of think about projects and to evaluate projects, and to just be like, if you're starting a project or working on one, just checking with this equation and seeing if there are other ways you can be potentially more innovative or more effective in your efforts. So we'll move to the next slide. And so these are the climate communication principles we've been working with. I'm going to get into these more when I talk about the examples, but just to put them up there, and then we'll just move to the next slide. And I wanted to give a shout out to Stephen Shepard, who's our expert, one of our expert guests today, who wrote the book Visualizing Climate Change, which I mentioned in earlier sessions, which I drew on for the innovation equation to some extent. And that it's an excellent book if you haven't checked it out yet. It's just talking about, yeah, how to make climate change more visible for communities. And there's some really good case studies in there. So I encourage you to check that out. And then just on the right-hand side, an op-ed that was recently published by Stephen and James Boothroyd about this idea of harnessing citizen power for dealing with the climate emergency at a local level. So they have some, in that article, they have some great, very clear motivating ideas for policy action at the municipal levels. So I encourage you to check that out, and we'll include that in the resources when we follow up after this session. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. And then this is just part of the equation, the community assets. So I won't go through them all, but they're there if you want to revisit them later, just thinking about what's available to the community now. And then we'll move to the next slide. And then the strategic allies. So these are some examples of strategic allies that exist in our networks. And so we'll move to the next slide. Okay, so we'll just jump into some case examples. The first one is Atlanta's, Brown Mill Urban Food Forest in Atlanta. So this is a really interesting example of the community really coming together to transform a park. The park was actually originally a farm, like 75 years earlier. It acted as a farm, and then it was turned into a city park. And it located in a neighborhood that was deemed a food desert. So there was no fresh food for, I think it was like 15 miles or something like that. Like you couldn't walk to get fresh food in the neighborhood that it was in, and predominantly low income people of color living in this neighborhood. And so the foundation and the city and local residents and local nonprofit organizations teamed up to reimagine what this park could look like. And they settled on this idea of a food forest, which for those who don't know, it approaches conservation using the concept of agroforestry. So using agriculture that integrates trees and shrubs with food production to create healthy and ecologically resilient landscapes. So that means they use native trees, plants to produce nutritious food, but also provide resources to local wildlife, pollinator species. They capture stormwater to mitigate flooding. They filter air and water and create more sustainable urban landscapes. So that was the kind of vision behind it. And it's different from a community garden because there's no individual plots, and it's designed around native plants, and is sort of built up from the input from community members and a lot of the time Indigenous community members who advise on Indigenous plants and different plants that can work together in a food forest. And so we'll just move to the next slide. So just to go into some of the communication principles that I mentioned earlier. You know, I was kind of mentioning with the principle of being local. I mean, it speaks for itself. It's a local park. It's local people who came up with the idea and the visioning. And then to move on to the second one, the visual, they do a really good job of showing what the community is doing. So the community in action. So you can see in these photos, people at a meeting, kids playing and dressing up in costumes, people gardening. I think pictures of the harvest is really important, really appealing to people. It really shows like a tangible outcome of people's work. And you know, these pictures are very inviting. And so just, you know, they're doing a really good job of showing images of community that warm people's hearts and make them want to be involved. We'll move to the next slide. And then another, you know, important part with the of the principles is the idea of connecting the issues together. So it's not just about green infrastructure; it's about the social connection, the economic potential. So in this case, the residents participate in a paid workforce training opportunities. And several people are employed at the food forest, but they also learn skills that can be applied in other realms. So keeping that economic piece in mind. And then also, you know, people who can't access fresh food because of the distance, but also because of the cost. As we know, fresh food is becoming more expensive. So really adhering to people's economic needs and connecting that to a concept like green infrastructure. So they're doing a really good job of making those connections for folks. And then also, you know, walking trails to provide opportunities for exercise and community building. And so really a holistic approach. We'll move on to the next slide. And then I spoke to this a little bit already, but targeted. So they, you know, they're located in a neighborhood, as I mentioned, a low income neighborhood, and like reflecting that community, the needs of that community back to itself, and really listening. You know, the food forest was designed by the community, and you know, it was a year of consultation that went into it. And so just really helping the community articulate what their needs are, and then, you know, following through on that was something that it looks like they've done really well. And I think that's led to the success of the community, or the success of the food forest, because ultimately it's stewarded by the community. So if they feel like they've been consulted and brought into the process, it's more likely to succeed in the long run. We'll move to the next slide. And then bold is the last principle. So this garden is the largest free food forest in the United States. So they started out with that vision. They had this big park, underutilized green space in the city that was in the middle of a food desert. And they said, we could make this the largest food forest in the country. And they did it. So I think just coming back to the idea of not limiting ourselves to narrow visions of what we can achieve, and keeping our, you know, our goals bold allows us to not only potentially do more, but invite more people into an inspiring vision. So we'll just move to the next slide. I had a slide. I thought I had a slide in there about Vancouver's food forest, but I just wanted to mention that um, the food forest movement is quite active in Vancouver. There's one in Riley Park and Kitsilano and Renfrew Collingwood, and one near Trout Lake. So this is happening locally here as well. There's a lot of potential for it to grow, and there's one that's being contemplated at Hastings Sunrise that was initiated by residents. That's quite exciting. So we'll include it in the resources, but just to say that this is happening here, and you can go and visit them now. And there's one actually right near my house. It's thriving. It's a beautiful space. I recommend checking them out if you have the time. So moving on to the second case, 12,000 Rain Gardens in Puget Sound. So this is a campaign that promotes rain gardens to address problems of untreated and uncontrolled stormwater runoff to create climate resiliency. So for those who don't know, a rain garden is like a bowl-shaped garden that captures and filters stormwater runoff from like roofs and driveways and other hard surfaces, and keeps it from becoming harmful water pollution. It was talked about in the video a little bit. And so this project it's interesting. It's local, but regional. So you can see on the map there, it's the Puget Sound area. So it's not just like a local neighborhood, but it does operate in that way in a sense, because you can see on the map, there's like the different rain gardens that are kind of popping up in the region, but then it's combining the region as one to have this goal of like 12,000 rain gardens. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Then on the right hand side is just the different events that they're holding, and how they're engaging the local community. We'll move to the next slide. Visual, so the before and after is a really powerful tool to use, I think, in this context. Obviously, things that quantify the amount of water that's being diverted is useful. So the image on the left, and then again, just the community working together and what that looks like is a powerful visual to use as well. And we'll move to the next slide. Connected, so they're connecting the rain gardens to marine life and the health of salmon and orcas and things like that. They often connect it to climate change and other sort of climate related issues, which is working quite well for them, I would say. And we'll move to the next slide. Targeted, so I feel like it's quite a open project in the sense, but these testimonials from people, it seems like they're targeting women who have home owners who are women, is how I would probably describe that. But I think testimonials can be really powerful in articulating who your target audience is and how the project is making a difference in their lives. So we'll move to the next slide. And then bold. So obviously the goal of 12,000 rain gardens is a big goal, and they're about halfway there. And on their website, you can add your own rain garden. So you can kind of like be in this, you can visualize your contribution to this really ambitious project. Okay, so we'll move on to the third example. Oh, before I do that, I just wanted to highlight Joanna Ashworth, who's part of this series, has been part of the North Shore Rain Garden Project, which has been a successful project on the North Shore of Vancouver. And the article, which we will link to, does a really good job of explaining rain gardens in general and how the North Shore Rain Garden Project is playing out. So I encourage you to check that out and potentially follow up with Joanna if you want to learn more. Okay, so next slide. Okay, and finally, the Green Block Neighborhoods Project. So I mentioned this in the first session, but I wanted to elaborate on it a bit more here because they're doing some things really well. So it's a grassroots initiative where neighbors work together to collectively reduce their ecological footprint through neighborhood-based actions such as building community gardens and pollinator pathways, hosting park-based and street-based and school-based educational activities, and host zero waste workshops and build sharing libraries. So it's kind of got like a broad set of activities, but there is quite a few green infrastructure themes that run through what they're doing. So obviously this is local. So this is at a neighborhood block level, which is hyper local. And their final report really does a great job of going into how they've done it, how they did it, how they conceptualized it. Again, we'll link to that in the resources, but one of their goals for the locality was this idea of motivated champions. So really kind of engaging people identifying people in the community who are really going to move the project forward and engaging them. And then the micro scale, obviously I mentioned the city block scale is a very accessible sort of conceptual area to wrap your head around. It's not overwhelming for folks. They can engaging people on their block seems accessible. We'll move to the next slide. They did visuals really well, especially when around this issue of the carbon footprint. So the kind of quantifying your eco footprint, comparing it to other neighborhoods, comparing it to other cities and other regions. So they did a series of visuals that I thought were quite effective in that way. We'll move to the next slide. Targeted. So I thought they did a really good job. They say in their the materials that their focus was always families and particular intergenerational activities for young kids. So I feel like this is a really powerful target, is kids and their parents. So you make something, I find if you make something fun for kids, it's usually fun for the parents too in some tangential way. And it just brings like a heartwarming, kind of vibe to a community project. So I thought that was really great that they had that really kind of clear in their minds that that's who their target was. And we'll just move to the next slide. And just talking about strategic allies. So they partnered with Evergreen, which is a environmental kind of foundation that funds projects like this, and quite a close relationship with the City of Vancouver and other nonprofits in the region that helped kind of execute or helped in other ways to get the project kind of up and running and contributing in different ways. And we'll move to the next slide. And then they just utilized a really good job of utilizing community assets. So they, brought in people from the neighborhood to do workshops on like clothing repair, or gardening, or cooking, or building retrofits. They use local art, local neighborhood cleanups, like material tool exchange and material exchange locations were set up. They did walking and cycling promotion. And so they did a lot of it seemed like they did an assessment of what the community assets were and really drew on those in various ways. And that allowed for a lot of creative and engaging ideas to come up. So I'll move to the next slide. So before I introduce Stephen and Cheryl, I just wanted to say, so the Green Block project has wrapped up. It's kind of came to the end of its tenure. But Stephen and Cheryl's work actually drew on, as far as I understand, draws on a lot of the lessons learned from the Green Block project. And one of my hopes with selecting some of these cases were exactly that, like these examples aren't necessarily designed to last forever. They might last for 2-3 years. But then especially when they're done well and they're articulated well, other people can pick them up and make them make sense for their neighborhood and be implemented. And I think this is a really good example of that. And same with the rain gardens and the food forests. They can be, lessons can be garnered and then they can be brought to other contexts. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Stephen and Cheryl, and I'll just introduce them to start with. So Stephen Shepherd is a professor of forest resource management at the University of British Columbia, teaching in landscape and climate change planning, community engagement, and visualization. He has served as director of UBC's Bachelor of Urban Forestry program and directs the collaborative Collaborative for Advanced Landscape Planning, so CLAP, which is an interdisciplinary research group that works with communities on developing climate change and energy solutions. He's published 4 books, one of which I mentioned, the Visualizing Climate Change, and does a lot of research in the area of green infrastructure. And Cheryl is the community engagement coordinator at CLAP, so works with Stephen, and she has worked in the environmental education and engagement space for 6 years. And having lived, studied, and worked in 3 different countries, Singapore, the UK, and Canada, she brings her adaptability and cultural sensitivity to her engagement role. Cheryl has spoken both in English and French in video interviews with the CBC Canada and UBC Forestry, and has published public-facing articles for 2 years. So I will pass it over to them, and really looking forward to hearing what they have to say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tara. I appreciate that. And we'll jump right in here because I think our role is to comment briefly on what you just went through, Tara, and those were some terrific examples. And then we'll show a couple of slides, and then Cheryl will pick up some further responses to what you said and finish up with a description of one of the relevant projects. So I think maybe we could go to one slide, the next slide, please, just as backdrop. I'll let you look at that while I'm just talking briefly. I'll come back to this in a second. But I think, Tara, your cases really demonstrate the range of benefits that come from green infrastructure built into climate action and community engagement. And I really like the way you've structured this. I think, there's very simple direction to community groups or homeowners or neighborhood organizations. And just a couple of quick points before we move into the slides. The visible demonstration projects, I think, are really important, and you showed some great examples of that, because people can't see climate action going on around them, and they need to see that. They need to see other people engaged in it, and that will by itself motivate further action, we hope. And in one of the breakout groups, we were talking about the pollinator corridors, and as an example, sort of draws people into the space of green infrastructure and potentially climate action. But that this can be a sort of a journey that would bring people into this discussion that then may lead to more significant mitigation, carbon sequestration kind of issues. And as well, the pollinators, of course, connect people along alleys and along connections. I know in the North Shore they're doing that too. The North Vancouver rain gardens, those kind of things, all great. So with that, I'm just going to make a couple of quick points and then show 2 or 3 visuals and then hand it over to Cheryl. Much more that I hope, can talk about that later. On this graphic that I borrowed from Dr. Sarah Barron at UBC, on the left, I'd like you to look at where it says mitigate climate change. These are all the various things that urban forests do and trees do for people. We won't go through them all. But one of them is sequestering carbon, and the other one is decreasing building energy. And those are direct ways to actually mitigate climate change and reduce carbon footprints that are often left out of the equation for behavior change, et cetera. Sequestering carbon, through absorbing carbon dioxide. I don't know if you can see the details there, but something like 400 million tons of carbon is sequestered by urban trees in the United States each year. But that's actually not the biggest contribution to reducing carbon footprints. Decreasing building energy through shading buildings, cooling air temperatures, sheltering buildings can have 3 to 5 times as much impact on carbon footprints, even as sequestering. So there are multiple ways that these can help. And if you can go to the next slide, please. This is just a picture of Street View in a nice leafy area of Kitsilano, one of the neighborhoods with more canopy. But just imagine what it would be like if we lost those street trees. So if you go to the next slide, we'll show you a worst case Photoshop scenario of what happens if those trees die in the droughts, which is starting to happen if they're not well watered. So stewardship of those trees is important. Visuals can be really powerful to remind people that we're not in a static state and we have to control the changes that are going to happen in the future. So a powerful tool. And if you go to the next slide, show you one more example of that. And this is an existing view on the North Shore. It's actually in North Van, a very beautiful, well-wooded area. It looks lovely, right? But it's high carbon and it's high vulnerability to climate change. So how do we retrofit these kind of neighborhoods? And again, through the magic of Photoshop, if you go to the next slide, you should see about 12 different ways that those neighborhoods will really need to be retrofitted. This is what you referred to earlier on, Oliver, as the need to transform where we live if we're going to reduce footprints and reduce our own vulnerability to climate change. And I'll let you sort of scan the number of things. You can see local food, you can see rain gardens, you can see moving in walkable services like offices and shops in neighborhoods which are food deserts right now. Next slide, please. And we're going to just finish up and hand over to Cheryl here to tell you more about this project. But I just wanted to show you that even with COVID and with sort of online ways of connecting with people through social media or through the inevitable Zoom, like you see here, these are graphics that were actually developed live by groups of people who don't even know each other sometimes, in how can we modify our own landscapes, both the public sector and the roadways and depaving and putting in private development of trees and food and things like that. These are tools that can help stimulate people's idea of what the future could look like. And I'm going to let Cheryl tell you more about a process that includes this and other kinds of ideas. Cheryl, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So yeah, one of the ways in which we tried to spin off this idea, back to what Tara was mentioning about, climate communications principles, how do we make it visual? How do we make it fun and attractive and engaging? We thought one of the ways in which we can engage people who might not necessarily be as involved would be to go to the neighborhoods and leverage the community hubs there, like the schools and the community centers. How do we get every resident on the ground to get climate action going in a way that would make their neighbors around them say, oh, what's going on in their garden? What's in their backyard? They look like they have a lot of trees. That looks great. How can I get involved? So that's what kind of birthed the idea of Coolhood Champs. If we can go to the next slide. So because we worked pretty closely with Vancouver Park Board and the City of Vancouver, and we were also very fortunate to be funded by the Park Board's Neighborhood Matching Fund last year, and then this year we're now funded by City of Vancouver's Greener City Grant. We also do our best to link all our climate champions actions back to the city's urban forest strategy, as well as their climate emergency action plan. And so Stephen mentioned earlier about climate mitigation and adaptation. We try as much to encourage our champions to take action that would indeed improve the overall green infrastructure of our city, whether it's through planting trees or community gardening, like earlier mentioned about places like Riley Park. One of our champions actually managed to get involved with the Riley Park Community Garden after getting involved in our program. So that's one of those legacies that has emerged from the program as well. You can go to the next slide. It shows you some of the projects that our champions engaged in after the program, that we're just super happy to hear from them about what they have done since then. So tree planting was one of the key things and super related to green infrastructure as well. Thankfully, we managed to get Park Board to gift free trees to all our champions. So they got to bring these trees back home, plant it in their yards like you see in the photos here. And some of them who did not have their own backyards or did not own their property, they took the trees and then they donated it to their friends who have private property that they can plant it on. So it's kind of like a paid forward process, and it gets even more people talking and even more people involved in this championing of climate action on the ground. So that was very exciting to see. The next, if you can click, please. Thank you. And so Another of our champions also ended up using her Instagram account. She created a completely new account to educate and engage other people in the climate action process. So she uses this Instagram account basically to not just track what she has done in her own backyard in terms of gardening with her mom. She also then gets people to ask her questions about, what gardening tips do you have, or what gardening tips does her own followers have for the people who are already watching her Instagram account. So again, it's kind of mixing up both climate action together with an ongoing process of education and awareness. On the next click, the Suzuki Elders also, thankfully we had Erlene and Pat, if you might know a couple of them, from Suzuki Elders who joined our Champions program, and they also went on to write on their blog about their learnings from the process. And this article over here is about galvanizing climate action. But Erlene also wrote another post more recently in December about how she tried to enliven her alley, her back alley behind her house. And this was a reflection of, when she saw people throwing away their Christmas trees immediately after the season. And she was just thinking about, how our wasteful culture and consumerism, I think we talked about that in our breakout group earlier as well, how that has really caused people to not value the natural assets around them. So that was a very reflective spiritual piece as well. And finally, we also have a lot of gardening projects came out of our Champions process, which was wonderful. Some of them created their own new gardens. Some of them ended up talking to one another and sharing tips on gardening, or just, visiting one another's gardens. People got involved in the Master Gardener process. I think they also ended up communicating on their own Instagram pages and through email, sharing what they learned, the latest learnings that they had on gardening. And so they within their own network, they just kept building it up. And that was really great to see, kind of like how Green Dot left its legacy as well. Go to the next slide, please. So yeah, these are just a summary of what we found. A lot of it on top of engaging climate action, we also realized that some of the benefits of the program in terms of engagement were just building confidence, building people's motivation, and getting them to talk to other people, which means the word keeps spreading as well. And finally, on the next slide, so this year we're super excited to be able to run the second series of workshops, second cohort, I suppose. So last year we did a pilot program, and this year, because of the latest funding from the Greener City Grant, we are managing to continue our workshops. So they'll begin in June in Killarney and in July at Hastings, and it will be in Trout Lake in the fall as well. So we would love to see some of you there if you are interested, or if you want to bring your friends or share this with your network, feel free to. And I just want to shout out to, I think Claire Johnson was here in the call earlier. She was one of our champions in the last cohort as well. So thanks for being here, and lovely to see you all as well. Thank you.
That's great, Cheryl. Thank you so much, and Stephen, for reflecting on what you see as the strengths of some of these projects, and also for sharing the work that you're doing. It's really very inspiring. I think for those of us who work in different sites, I can see in the chat people are already starting to connect the dots in terms of how they might apply the location where they're situated to some of the ideas that have been shared here today. So wonderful stimulation. Anyway, so we're getting to this point in the conversation where we want to invite further questions. Here's a few to prompt you, but I'm sure people have lots of other thoughts as well. But what are some of the barriers to community-led infrastructure projects? How can visualization be used? And I think we saw some great examples of how that sparks people's imagination, helps them see climate action in real time. And how does green infrastructure improve quality of life and climate resiliency for underserved communities? And how can that be communicated in compelling ways? And for those of you who are working in research, what kind of research would support this work? What kind of research are you doing right now? I know in my small group had the chance of speaking with, I think it's Joseph, who's a landscape architect, and just looking at the ways that research and change in the training of architects, landscape architects, can make a difference. So please share your thoughts in the chat, and we'll just kind of go through your questions, and you can direct them at Tara, at Cheryl, or Stephen. Or if you would just like to comment what has arisen for you as a result of hearing about all of these various stories and seeing the communications model applied to these actions. So here's from Jennifer saying that on the barriers, are there municipal regulations, procedures that pose an impact, on the barriers, are there municipal regulations, procedures that pose a practical barrier to implementation despite the supportive policies and plans? So what's happening at the municipal level that actually can enable, and what's not happening, that maybe is creating a barrier, if I'm understanding that question correctly? Does anyone want to talk about the policy levels? Like, what would really enhance the work at the community level? What policies do we need to have that would really support local action? Stephen or Cheryl or Tara, do you want to jump in on that?
I'm happy to speak to it. Tara, did you want to say something first?
I was just thinking that Joanna, after Stephen speaks, if you wanted to mention your experience with the rain garden and how, I'm curious if you had access to grants or how that process was as a community organizer to make a rain garden happen in your neighborhood. But that's all that came to mind.
Yeah. Stephen, go ahead. I think.
Yeah, just really quickly, and Cheryl, you I think you can back me up on this one. One of the outcomes from the Green Block process, we've been working with people like Andrea Serra in the Dunbar area who've been working on pollinators and community gardens, etc. And part of the problem is that when you're trying to work on public land, then you certainly run into barriers. And Green Block found that to be quite a frustration. It also links to some things that I think Joseph was talking about earlier in our group, about these policy constraints. And so, the boulevards and parks are great places for these community projects, but they run into barriers around maintenance, around perceived safety hazards, getting permits for even small wooden constructions. So you do have to be pretty careful and pretty savvy about that. They're not necessarily quick and easy to do. That's one of the attractions, but also a challenge of trying to get those kinds of things on private land, which of course a municipality can't force, but community groups can do that. And I know there's basically a mini urban farm 2 blocks from my house where 3 neighbors have taken their fences down and they're sharing their land together. And that's maybe an extreme example, but you can do a lot with rain gardens and tree planting and stormwater management on your property that would benefit everybody and hopefully get other people doing something similar. So, but there are real barriers on the public land particularly.
Yeah, great. Those are great points. And I in our small group, there was Cheryl from New West was talking about, supporting a shift in, people that are interested in gardening, try to build on that interest and leverage that interest, and to look more at pollinators, at native plantings, at trying to make the connection much more specific. And I think that speaks to the communications model that, let's make these connections more explicit and maybe focus on the things that are going to have the biggest impact, in terms of mitigation and adaptation, make us more resilient. So I think, from the policy level, I'll just say a little bit about the North Shore Rain Garden Project. We worked with 3 municipalities, but basically we raised all the funding through foundations, and Nature Trust of BC was a big supporter. The local governments were also supportive in terms of, machinery and equipment and, materials. But it was the community that really pushed to say, we're going to take care of this garden, because that is a big issue with green infrastructure. And I see there's a question about incorporating green infrastructure into more common municipal retrofits. And we see the city of Vancouver has a fantastic rain garden strategy. They're doing that. maybe we don't even know they're doing it in some places. It's sort of invisible. It's just improving what's happening under the ground and making the, recharging the groundwater in ways that we don't see, but that's better for tree life and longevity, resilience of trees in the city. But I think having a municipal government that gets the value of green infrastructure in combination with a community that actually understands that this is really important. And I think the only way people will begin to understand it is if they get their hands in the dirt, like quite literally, and understand that this, helping nature do its work of filtering and managing water is actually doing climate action. And they start to care about these gardens and take care of them. And I think that's one of the hesitancies of some private landowners or new developments and developers, is not understanding, how to maintain over time some of these projects. But as you all know who work in community, the more community is involved, the more stewardship responsibility it tends to feel. And I think that's, communicating that is one of our challenges. And I think that one of the opportunities that has been explored here in this session today. And other questions? Anyone comments from the panel on Canada's National Infrastructure Assessment and the contribution of green infrastructure? That's a really good question. I know that, our coming back from COVID strategy is, part of it is investments in infrastructure. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on, how does that translate into investments in green infrastructure? Because there's certainly a huge opportunity there. Stephen, is that something that you've looked at the sort of national policy level?
Probably not as much as it should be. I mean, there are huge initiatives underway. The 2 billion trees, and I think there was something in the chat about other federal programs, the Canada's National Infrastructure Assessment. I think those are really good questions. We haven't looked into it anything like enough, and that we've got a feeling there might be a couple of people in the group here who've made comments about the policy side or the funding side that might have some other ideas. But I think it's an urgent priority, frankly, is bringing those levels of government together. And I think Arjun made a comment about building capacity in local governments so that there's an increased understanding, increased familiarity, comfort level maybe with engaging communities to develop their own infrastructure to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the city of Victoria has a fund in there to support the building of rain gardens. I think that the 12,000 Rain Garden Project as well has worked with local governments so that they can find funding so people can apply for money. If they want to convert their lawns into a rain garden, they can apply for some nominal amount of money for the planting, and and they also get support from their neighbors to actually install these. So I think the more systems that we can support to enable these actions on the ground, the more longevity, the more sustainable these projects are going to be. So how is this? Here's a question. How is the city protecting marginalized communities invest in green infrastructure in their community, but then they're displaced by gentrification after the work is done? And I think, Tara, you referred to that. And we certainly have seen that with bike routes, that right away property values went up if you were in a neighborhood with a bike route. And I think the more we see improvements in communities, making them more livable, then we have this unintended consequence. But now I think we're much more aware of it. Tara, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would just say, I think this speaks to the importance of articulating the connections between the issues when these projects are being proposed or when consultations are going on. I mean, it's hard to stop the juggernaut of gentrification, especially in a city like Vancouver, but I think we can put the equity piece front and center when we're talking about environmental issues. I mean, that's been a point we've been trying to make this whole series, is that we have to solve these problems simultaneously if they're going to have the impacts that we're looking for. And so I'll share it in the chat, the link to the article about the food forest that's being developed in Hastings Sunrise, but that was, you know, put forward by residents. And that park includes like low-income BC housing complexes, the Aboriginal Mothers Center, the Quasin Neighborhood House, all of which are partners and all of which are underserved, you know, quote unquote communities. So I think it helps when those, you know, communities that are in the neighborhood are involved. It won't necessarily, you know, stop gentrification in its tracks, but I think it'll make it harder to push through inequitable building and zoning strategies and things like that. So it builds a community of resistance, if you will, against it that might not otherwise be there. And it does it in a way like building a garden together or a food forest together can build connections that are strong and long lasting. So yeah, that would be my response. Other folks might have other ideas around it, but that's what comes to mind to me right away.
Yeah, I think when I look through the chat, there are just so many wonderful questions and comments and resources that we don't have time to get into, but we will gather them up and we will make sure that you have access to them. And if there are specific questions that we can answer or direct you to a resource, then we'll do our best to follow up with that. So I'm just going to have to bring our session to a conclusion. We're just about at time right now. Maybe if those of you who can stay on a little bit are willing to do so, we'd love to have a proper kind of farewell to the series. But I just want to take a moment now to thank Cheryl and Stephen for joining us today and bringing your expertise. It's just been wonderful having you here. And appreciate the creative work that you're doing, and good luck with the next series. So, you know, great to have a chance to let people know. Look, I think it's mostly for Vancouverites, but please be inspired to duplicate these efforts. I know I certainly was when I saw the 12,000 rain garden. That really inspired me to get going on the North Shore where I live. So there's so many ways that we can learn and springboard. So we're so glad to have heard more about your project at CALP, the Cool Hood project. Thank you. And Tara, I just want to thank you also for your wonderful work bringing these stories to us, bringing them with a lens, a communications lens that I think is really important. I think Stephen really outlined that, you know, underlined that for us, that if we can't see it, it's almost like it's not there. And we need to find ways to bring images and stories to people that allow them into the conversation. And, you know, like today, talking about green infrastructure, it is really an entry point, as was waste, as was talking about energy, as was transportation. These are entry points. So bring people in where their interests are, where their talents are. I think that's really what we're talking about when we talk about solutions-oriented and creative communications approaches to climate action. And that's really what we've been trying to do with this whole series. So just in conclusion, I want to thank everybody that has shown up over the past 4 weeks in May. And thank you for your really engaged participation, your resources and ideas, and the new relationships that you formed, I hope will support you in your work to come. So stay tuned. We'll send you a link to the resources from last week and this week, and also a survey to invite you to give us feedback on your experience. So thanks also to, maybe I'll just turn over to Oliver and then to Tara and our great students from REM, who just to give a kind of closing reflection really quickly.
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I'll just echo your comments, Joanna. Thanks everyone for being such active participants. I'm blown away by the amount of information and conversations happening in the chat, and I'm sure in the breakout groups as well. I just wanted to add that SPEC's doors are open to anybody who's interested in bringing their ideas, their projects to other like-minded people. We do have monthly meetings under different themes with volunteers and staff, and a lot of the projects that SPEC runs started that way. People bring in ideas or a project that they're already running, and a lot of partnerships have formed that way. Funding has been found to support different initiatives. Obviously, not every single time, but that's how most of our projects actually run today, is community members connecting with us and with other people in our teams. So I invite you, check our website. We have 3 monthly meetings, different days. So different days and times to make it more accessible to people. Yeah, I look forward to connecting, and thank you, Tara, Stephen, and Cheryl in particular today for your words and your expertise. Tara?
Yeah, I would just say, there's an image I wanted to highlight. I think I did, I brought this in the first session, but I wanted to bring it back. Courtney, if you could just move to the next. So this is this is from the authors of All You Can Save, which is an excellent book on climate feminism. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend, especially the audiobook. I listened to the audiobook, which has celebrity women reading the different chapters. But they talk about, this as a way to kind of map your entry into climate engagement. So if you work with young people, or even, older people who, obviously care about the issue, but don't necessarily know how they can enter into the space, this is a nice way to sort of think about it. And it's been really helpful for me. And yeah, I just wanted to echo what other people have said. It's been really great to be a part of this. And it just reminded me that, thinking about climate change can be so isolating and scary sometimes. And coming into community, it reminds me that I'm not alone in this, and we're going to solve it together. And there's millions of people out there that care about this issue and are working on it. And this is just an example of that. And that warms my heart and makes me feel better about getting up the next day and doing it again. So thank you for your presence. And yeah, I look forward to the next thing that we do. Hopefully we'll do another, I don't know what it will look like in a post vaccine world, but hopefully we'll get to see each other in person one day, or in another context. So thank you, everyone. And thank you to Joanna and Oliver and the team for inviting me on.
Great, thanks, Tara. And just quickly, our 2 students from the Faculty of Environment who are working in the background, gathering the resources and doing the reporting, I just, from a young scholar's perspective, be interested to hear, where things have landed for you. And I know Nastanka Calle Delgado from PICS, who is our wonderful supporter from PICS, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, is also on the call. And I'm wondering, Nastanka, if you would like to say anything about what you're taking from the session. And I know you have a call for applications coming up. People might be interested in hearing more about that. So Colleen and Emmanuel, would you like to just jump in?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, just echoing what's already been said, it's been so lovely and inspiring to see how engaged everyone has been. And your participation has really made this so much more exciting for all of us involved in putting it on. And something that's really stuck out for me has been the connections formed. I've really loved chatting in the small groups and kind of hearing a bit more about where people are coming from in their professional lives and their personal lives. And it's been really great to have all these stories of experiences and perspectives and kind of working towards this common goal, but from so many different directions. So it's been really great, and I can't thank you all enough.
Great, thank you, Colleen. Thanks for your work. Emmanuel?
Yeah, the same. I've been very intrigued to be a part of this. I feel like I've learned a lot more than I've participated, and you know, I feel like the zeal and enthusiasm that I get from each group that I've been in just echoes to me that there's hope in the future, and it shows that with a little bit of more effort, we can actually get to where we want to be as regards this topic. And I'm very happy to have been a part of this and to have learned from every single person that I've talked with. And I do hope that it's been a fun and learning experience for everyone too that has been part of this, whether you started this session with us or you just joined in one of the other sessions. And I look forward to meeting with some of you maybe in future and see where we can go from there.
That's great. Thanks, Emmanuel and Colleen. Great to have you and the work that you've been doing behind the scenes, helping us gather and organize the information. Has been really, really, really valuable. Nastenka from PICS, I don't know if you have a moment, but I do know that there's a call for proposals, the Pacific Institute for Climate Action, and you've just been a wonderful supporter of the series. I want to thank you and the organization for backing us and being a part of this series, and we hope to collaborate again.
Yes, no, I think it's been great to be part of this, and as always, I am eager and look for ways how to support, advance this, to engage in this type of conversations on advancing climate solutions and research. And as I mentioned, right now there is a call for proposals where we are inviting researchers and solution seekers like indigenous municipalities, whether proposals to mitigation solutions, research to advance those in scale up. Many of these amazing work and studies that has been highlighted in this series. So, yeah, so if you want to learn more, I just put the link out there, and also you can contact me directly and I can talk about the program and how you can.
Thanks, Nastenka. We're having a little bit of trouble with the audio, but
okay.
see that you put the funding opportunity link up in the chat so people can take a look at that, and that they can reach out to you through this link. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah. Thank you so much for all your support. Really appreciate it. And just in closing, I know we're losing people. Everyone's kind of dashing off to the next meeting. We intentionally tried to keep this shorter just for that reason, but just a final word fall to end. This has been all about action, climate action, creative action, informed, looking at the big levers, the areas where we can have the biggest impact. And I'm just wondering if there's a word or a phrase that you could share about your commitment to climate action moving forward. And if you could put it in the chat, and I give you a second or two to write it in, and then we'll do a word fall where we all enter our commitments in together. So just take a moment and share one word that describes your commitment to climate action, or a phrase. And I'm going to count you down in 3, 2, 1, and press return. Okay, inspired, collaboration. Literacy, gardens, shared responsibility, unwavering. Biking, forever, hope, local, collaboration, inspired, all in. 9 years left, rain gardens, urgency. Yeah, these are really transpiration, no plan B, forest bathing, empathy, policy change. These are wonderful words to encourage us all to do what we can wherever we are. And thank you so much for being here. And we hope to see you again very soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.